Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to concurrent session number 2. This is Biosecurity and Herd Management. Our first speaker today will be Dr. Bret Marsh. After a career in public service that spanned 40 years, 30 of which were as Indiana State Veterinarian and head of the Indiana State Board of Animal Health, Purdue alumni Bret Marsh, DVM, became the Purdue University College of Vet Med's new dean and veterinary hospital CEO in November. He also holds the title of Clinical Professor of Veterinary Medicine. He's a first-generation college student from rural Indiana, and he earned his bachelor's degree in animal sciences from Purdue's College of Ag before graduating in the college that he now leads, earning his Doctor of Veterinary Medicine degree in 1984. In addition to the service to the state of Indiana, Dr. Marsh has held several national leadership roles. He served as a special detail to the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture's Homeland Security staff following 9/11 and provided leadership to the United States Animal Health Association, serving as president and as member of its board of directors. You might be familiar with the American Veterinary Medical Association, which is the primary accrediting body for colleges of veterinary medicine worldwide. The association had the privilege of Dr. Marsh's service as the Indiana delegate and a 6-time treasurer, and he served the Indiana Veterinary Medical Association as its president and board chair. Help me in welcoming Dr. Bret Marsh to the stage.
Thank you very much. Appreciate the introduction, and it'll be a little different this time because I have no slides. So you don't need a computer and you don't need a phone. We're just going to talk for a while about some of the things that are going on in the preparedness field. I'm particularly pleased to be in this room with cyclones on the walls because as an Indiana Pacers fan, your Tyrese Halliburton got us to the finals, and when he hit the floor, unfortunately our hopes of a championship went with him. But he's had his Achilles tendon repaired, and we hope to get him healed up and back on the court here, maybe not next season, but the following. It's a great pleasure to be here as a part of the Iowa Swine Day. I was actually invited to come last year when I was serving as state veterinarian, and I could not make it. And so then Stacy sent me an invitation to come back this year, and I said, well, I'm no longer in that role. I don't think I fit the bill. So she apparently went back and asked somebody and said, yes, you fit the bill, why don't you come to Iowa? So I appreciate the opportunity to come and visit with you. Preparedness planning, of course, has been a big part of my role when I served as state veterinarian and continues in that role as Dean of the College of Veterinary Medicine at Purdue. I'm looking forward to tomorrow visiting your veterinary college and Dean Grooms. I want to see the new VDL. I saw an earlier rendition of it, so I'm going to go over there tomorrow morning before I head back to Indiana. But preparedness initiatives have been an important part of all of our commodities, and I think there are some important things for the swine industry in particular that are going to be extremely valuable as we move forward. And I thought it was particularly poignant to talk about some of the conversations this morning, whether it was talking about 80% of the pork production comes from 20 states. That's a big deal. It's a big country. And so where do we put our resources and where do we put our emphasis on how to protect this population? One of the things that always comes to mind right off the bat is, of course, identification. One of my greatest frustrations in my former role was to get a report back from a packing plant about an animal that's positive for something, and you don't know how to find it in the system. Because, for example, I had a steer one time that was shipped out of Indiana, and they reported out of a packing plant in Pennsylvania that the steer had tuberculosis. So I said, well, what's the ID on the steer? Didn't have any. He was 847 pounds hot weight hanging on the rail. He was black and he was about that big. And I don't know how many tens of thousands meet that criteria, right? And so identification becomes extremely important. We also found this out in 2003 when we ended up with the BSE cow, the mad cow in Washington State. I was working in DC at the time, and they came down the hall and they said, Bret, what do you think about this? And I said, it's going to impact our trade immediately. It was the cow. It only took one. It shut down the entire US beef export for a period of a decade. 10% of their product went out of the country, and I heard this morning yours is around 30. So 10% of the US beef trade was gone like that because of one cow. And I remember well, Ron DeHaven was administrator of APHIS at the time, and he was on the steps of the Witten building in Washington, D.C., to announce to the world that that cow didn't belong to us. She was from Canada. And do you know how they knew it? Because she had a tag in her ear. They could trace her back to Canada. So identification is extremely important in your commodity as well, because we get reports of challenges in identification. Yours more like the steer or the cow, maybe more like sows and boars, because straight hogs are going to a plant. We can identify those back with group lots, etc. But when you get down to sows and boars, that sow ID at the farm level is really important at the farm level, but once it leaves the property, that ID may not mean much to anyone else. And so when it gets to trying to identify an animal back to the site of origin, it gets to be really, really important to be able to do that. And so we used to trace pseudorabies and we trace swine brucellosis, et cetera. But I don't want to spend a lot of extra time trying to find a sow that was positive for FMD or African swine fever, because we don't have time. The way this industry moves, with the thousands of animals that move, millions of animals that move, and hundreds and thousands of trucks that are on the road every day, we don't have time in order to wait to figure out where an individual animal is from. So identification gets to be really, really important. And again, it's ID that is meaningful once it leaves the property. That's because, again, the sows may have their farrowing cards and all this sort of thing and IDs in their ears, but once they get on a truck and they end up in the marketing system, it may not be very meaningful once they come on down the line. So those electronic IDs are really valuable, and we've used them a lot. We've handed out millions of them in Indiana just to get them in sows' ears, cows' ears, and others, so we can find them in the system once they leave your properties. Because again, we don't have time. For example, I'll give you an example, and we talked a little bit about tomorrow I'll go see the diagnostic lab. I'll date myself a little with the old pseudorabies program, but we used to get reports of samples that went to the diagnostic laboratory at Purdue. And they would come back that a particular animal, a sow in this case, would be positive for pseudorabies. And they would fax that result to Indianapolis. And I'd get the result in Indianapolis, and so here's a positive report. And I would actually go get a county plat book, if we even remember what those are, a printed county plat book. And if you take a standard tuna can and put the center of that can on the site of infection and put a pencil circle around it, that's a 2-mile circle. And then I go to a copier and copy it and fold it up and mail it to the district veterinarian and say, the Marsh farm just broke. Be days, might be weeks, because I wanted him to go see everybody that was within 2 miles and let them know that the Marsh farm just broke with pseudorabies, right? We did that, believe it or not, and it wasn't all that long ago. We don't have time today. We're going to have to move much more quickly. And the other piece that goes with that is today we have premises identification. We didn't have any prem IDs at the time. Had rural routes, box numbers. And if you get into the Amish community, they're all Amos Wrangler, right? So you're trying to find the farm that's involved in this process. And so it's very different today. We were taking time then we didn't have, but today it's even more critical. In those days, for example, when we were testing pigs, sow farms to sell pigs, in our state in Indiana, we're number 5 in pork production and have been for a number of years. We had 10,000 farms, 10,000 that tested in order to sell feeder pigs. And that sector doesn't even exist today. So the movements of animals and the consolidation. I think the consolidation, of course, is important for us as well, because when things go bad, they can go bad big, because we put more animals on the site, and for economic reasons, et cetera, that we've gone that particular way. But therefore, we have to be more diligent about identification and knowing where animals are prior. Premises ID is really, really critical. We've told people, I don't need to know any more than a name and address and which species is on the property. And they were early concerned and said, well, there would be those that say, well, you're going to turn over, I've got 5,000 sows and you're going to turn that into the IRS and you got tax. And no, I don't care. I don't care how many you have on the site, because with the mad cow disease in Washington state, it only took one. So it really doesn't matter how many you have, because any one of them could be the one. So Prem ID is really important. I hope you've done that. It's come a long way from where it was. And in Indiana, for example, we have about 69,000 premises that have been registered now, of all types, of all species. But it's critical that we have ID in animals for a rapid traceability, and the premise IDs as well. But then when we detect something that's wrong, and I'll put this on myself, we've talked to producers and veterinarians and others in the allied industry about looking for vesicular disease, vesicles on animals, at the coronary band or on the snout, et cetera. We're looking for vesicles because we were talking about foot and mouth disease, right? But now we also have another threat like African swine fever, and it doesn't present that way. So we've coached people to look for one thing that we need to continue to watch for, but they may present with an entirely different clinical picture. So what are we really looking for? Things that are out of the ordinary. Now, when I was a fourth-year veterinary student at Purdue, I'd go down to the large animal clinic, and every morning you check to see if you had a case that day. And there was a clipboard down there that had the cases that came in for that day, and sure enough, Marsh, and I had a dairy cow, and Dr. Bain was a clinician on the case. And in the far right-hand column of that sheet was a remarks column. And the only thing in that column was ADR. Now, I didn't know what that meant. So I went to Dr. Bain on the case, and I said, you and I are supposed to work up this cow together, and it says something about ADR, and I don't know what that means. He said, you will by the time you graduate. So what's ADR mean? She ain't doing right. And that's what we're in the business for, aren't we? Things that ain't doing right. I live in town now. The lady across the street knows everything that goes on there. So if there's an ADR in our community, she knows about it. And so if you go to an airport, TSA is about the ADRs. And we're really in the ADR business. The sows are off feed. They're febrils. The pigs are dead. Something's out of the ordinary. And that's what we're really about, is trying to find those things that are out of the ordinary so we can respond to them quickly, because we don't have time. So what do you do when somebody says something's an ADR? What do you do with that information? Well, I hope you have relationships established with a veterinarian. So if you see something at a production level that's out of the ordinary, we do this in packing plants that are out of the ordinary. I had lunch with some folks from Tyson. So in packing plants, you're looking things that are out of the ordinary, that are unusual. So what do you do with that information? Well, at the production level, you get with the practicing veterinarian, and then they would call me and say, Bret, something's out of the ordinary. It might be something bad. And so we get samples off to the diagnostic lab to confirm one way or the other. Now, fortunately, we've not had these challenges, but I can remember distinctly, it was mentioned this morning in 2013, PED. I remember talking to practitioners who sent diagnostic samples to the laboratory thinking it was TGE, and it was not. So then what is it? And it was PED, as it turned out, but it was an ADR, and we got them off to the laboratory to find out. And I think it's important that all of us recognize, and you have a remarkable facility, and I'll see it again, or more of it tomorrow with your VDL here at Iowa State. But the citizens of the country have spent millions of dollars building diagnostic labs across our country. We have one at Purdue, the Animal Disease Diagnostic Laboratory, and they're spotted all over the country. But the citizens have actually spent a lot of money for these diagnostic purposes to make sure that we have that capability. And one of the things I tell our producers is, now you have to use that laboratory because I can't be there only for you when there's an emergency. So you're going to have to continue, because to have proficient staff, to have the equipment you need in place. And this really became apparent with highly pathogenic avian influenza. So the poultry industry uses that laboratory, and in order to keep it current and keep it up to speed, you have to have that staff and equipment in place. And as it turned out in Indiana earlier this year, we had the worst event we've ever had with highly pathogenic avian influenza. We were number 2 in eggs. I don't know that we are today. So we got a lot of birds in Indiana. We're number 1 in commercial ducks, number 2 in eggs, number 3 in pounds of turkey produced. And so there's a lot of birds. And in Indiana, we're the smallest state geographically west of the Appalachian Mountains. So we're not a very big state, but there's a lot of animal agriculture going on there. And as I already mentioned, we're number 5 in swine. We're also the crossroads of America, so we got roads going through. Right? So we have a lot of interstate systems. We've been through Indiana, come down to Indianapolis and 465 around the city. There's all sorts of traffic of all sorts of animal ag commodities. So if there's an event going on, it has some likelihood it might come through our state. So I think it's important that we're taking a look at this diagnostic service that we have, the National Animal Health Laboratory Network. I remember when it didn't exist. And for example, if we had highly pathogenic avian influenza before the NALN was established, you had to send them all off to the federal laboratory. There'd be no way in today's event that that could be accomplished We'd be totally overwhelmed at a federal laboratory. We needed laboratories out near the sites of production. And there was a horrific day in 9/11, but that was one of the silver linings of 9/11, because we were trying to secure the country. And how better to secure the country was, one, having the diagnostics closer to the sites of production. We already had the laboratories. We just needed to get them equipped and trained and put them a part of a network. And for me, well, they always happen at Friday at about 5 p.m. anyhow, right? Those ADR calls that come in about that time, at least I would have some assurance from my laboratory that was negative there. Now I need to still go to the National Laboratory for confirmation, but at least we had some sense of what was going on. So I applaud what you've done here in Iowa and states throughout the Midwest and the country to have these laboratories in place, because it's made a world of difference. And again, if we had to rely solely on the federal laboratories to do all the diagnostic work that's going on right now, it simply wouldn't be possible. The threats continue to change. I mentioned avian influenza. That used to be the disease of birds. And then it was a year ago, March, I got a phone call. Actually, it was an email on a weekend from the state veterinarian of Texas. And he said, there's something going on in the dairy herds in the panhandle of Texas, and we don't know what it is. I don't know if it's a foreign animal disease or what it might be going on, and Iowa State's lab got involved in this process as well. Turned out to be H5N1 in dairy cattle. Totally different deal. Said, how could that be? How could you have H5N1, particularly when you could swab the nasal swabs on those cows and you couldn't isolate the virus, but it was in the milk. And so suddenly you had a virus, an influenza virus that wasn't influenza-like. You had a whole new game. So then, of course, the pork industry says, are we next? Could we be next? What would be the consequences of having H5N1 in the pork industry? The dairy industry has certainly been through it. You know, they talk about sick pens on some of these dairy operations, have 500 cows in the sick pen. Not only lost production, but just treating cows and get them cared for, and it's hard on cows. Could that happen in the swine industry? And so I applaud again the swine industry to take a look at and prepare for those kind of events. What would that look like if you had that kind of situation? How would the diagnostics take place? What are you looking for clinically? Because the cows didn't present like the birds did. Because in birds, you know where a high path AI is, and you can follow that virus by its trail of mortality. Doesn't matter whether it's 6 birds in a backyard flock or 5 million layers. You'll know where it is, because it's going to show up because of the dead birds. Didn't happen that way in these dairy cows. So I think we're on high alert. And then you throw in something that I didn't think we'd ever have to talk about. New world screwworm, for heaven's sake. I mean, that was something you didn't even talk about. It's been decades gone from the United States. We'd pushed it out down through Central America into South America. New world screwworm. And of course, if you're familiar with that, unfortunately, we haven't had to worry about it in a long time, but rather than those fly larvae eating dead tissue, like we're familiar with maggots, these screwworm larvae eat live tissue. And so this is a whole new game, and we've been trying to keep it out of the United States. It's been gone for many decades, as I mentioned, and so now it's suddenly a threat, and we're not taking imports from Mexico right now. Could that be in the swine industry? Yeah, it could be. Now, we do have a lot of swine indoors, but we also have exhibition pigs that travel all over everywhere, don't we? And so actually I was at an exhibition not long ago, and they were unloading a barra pig. I said, so I hope you have a good show today. And they said, it's the 25th show for that pig. So that if there's something wrong, if there's an ADR with a pig, it could get around, right? So you've got a number of things. So you're talking about African swine fever. It was mentioned this morning about China. China, at least we saw in the news, or at least tried to understand the best we could what was going on in China, but then we end up with a diagnosis of the Dominican Republic and Haiti. I haven't personally been down there, but the reports that come back from that country is because of the economic situation on that island, the reality of eradicating that disease down there is going to be slim to none. Very difficult to do. It was done before in the late 70s, but to do it again and replicate that is going to be extremely difficult to do. So that threat persists, not very far from us. African or foot and mouth disease, for example, is on 4/5 of the globe. So there's a lot of land mass that has that virus as well. So the things that we can do to prepare, one, I hope you have a Prim ID, because in the role I was in before, you already know where those sites are before you ever start. When we got a report of highly pathogenic avian influenza, in a matter of seconds, we could determine how many commercial flocks were within 6 kilometers or 10 kilometers or whatever of that site. And you knew the kind of task that you were being dealt with. The most dense that we had in Northeast Indiana were 298 commercial sites in 6.2 miles. Now that's a lot of birds. Nearly 300 sites in 6 miles. Up in that country, they have brown egg layers, and they'll have these 25,000 birds outside, and they'll put up a building on a weekend. And so these are growing everywhere. If you have an avian influenza threat, it can move through there very quickly. Swine industry, depending on where you are with density, you could have the same kind of challenge with movements. But I think, again, early detection is going to be one of the most critical pieces that we have. Because if we're behind the curveball, we're trying to lead from behind, and we'll never get it done. And that's one of my gravest concerns with African swine fever, because it doesn't present like we've been coaching people for years looking for a vesicular disease. You might have mortality, et cetera, that might mimic a number of things. Has it been in the country for how long? How much have we moved it before we really determine where it exists? So I think for premise ID, individual ID, making sure we're supporting these diagnostic laboratories, that's really important. Some laboratories struggle in order to make sure that they're proficient in all those areas, but in your states, I hope you're continuing to support those laboratories. I think it's critical. The other thing that struck me again, this 80% coming from 20 states, I hope that the national pork industry is particularly looking in those 20 states, because I don't know that you need Rhode Island every day. There might be a day, but on the other hand, if you're putting resources in where most of these swine are located, because in my experience as a state veterinarian, some states are so grossly under-resourced to carry out the tasks they've been given. And so if you're trying to really accomplish a task to determine where disease is and to actually deal with it, because once we get that laboratory result, then that came to an office like mine, then I was to dispatch someone to go investigate, collect additional samples, et cetera. That might mean quarantining the site until you determine what's going on. The other thing that I think is really important with regard to that's taken place in this interface is something that we've never done in the United States before. And that is, if we diagnose African swine fever, for example, in the swine industry, let's say right here at Ames, we're going to do a 72-hour standstill. 72 hours, there's no swine on the road. So we're not going to move any pigs for a period of time. It kind of harkened back to something mentioned this morning as well. During 9/11, President Bush took all the planes out of the air. If you've read his book about that, he called his mother, Barbara, to see how she was doing, because of course everything was crazy, the security was at risk, et cetera, with our 9/11 event. And Barbara reported to George. He said, well, Mom, where are you? And she said, I'm in Madison, Wisconsin. And he said, Mom, what in the world are you doing in Madison, Wisconsin? She said, well, George, you took all the planes out of the air. It's the only place they dropped all the planes out, right? Same kind of thing. For 72 hours, no swine on the roads. To try and determine, so where does it exist? Can we try to get ahead of the event? Now, if it's already been around for 4 or 5 weeks, we're already behind. Because those 72 hours are not going to make a big difference if it's already been here and we've moved it for several weeks. It could make a big difference for us if we could gather all the information that we have. My guess is, though, if we end up with 72 hours, I'm not sure we'll have everything we need to know in 72 to release it. So it might be a little longer, and it might be a little longer yet. And so that load you were going to load out this morning to take to Tyson or wherever, no, it can't go, and it may not go for a little while longer, Does it sound familiar? Sound like we had this just a few years ago with COVID, didn't we? Totally unrelated to animal health, but we couldn't move a product. And what was the reason for that? Why couldn't we move them to the plant? Nobody was there. Yeah, nobody was there. We ended up with this, of course, all across the country. We had it in Indiana as well. And the first thing that happened that really impacted it was the schools closed. So somebody had to be with the children, and that meant the workers couldn't be at the plant, and you had this whole cascade, and it happened very fast, didn't it? And suddenly nothing was moving. Had nothing to do with animal health, but it certainly got to animal welfare pretty fast, didn't it? Because you couldn't move these pigs. And so things happened very quickly. So let's take that scenario and place it with an animal health event. Because in that situation, you may recall in COVID, we had pigs that ended up all over everywhere, didn't we? I remember talking to the state veterinarian in Connecticut. They had pigs from the Midwest in Connecticut because they would go to their local grocer and there was no pork on the shelf, and they said, well, I'll take some of those pigs, we'll home dress them. They ended up everywhere, because of the market pressure, no place for them to go. So we jump ahead and say, okay, now it's African swine fever. Now our producers, because it's African swine fever, the ethics of our producers, they're just not going to ship them everywhere. But you got a serious economic consequence, right? So what's next? We've tied them up. They're quarantined to the site. We're doing all the investigation. We're under a 72-hour standstill. Nothing's moving. And then what's next? Somebody's going to say, well, who's going to pay me for my loss? I can't move anything. You pay for these birds, 5 million layers in a layer house out here for high-path avian influenza. Are you going to pay me for my hogs for African swine fever? Yes, there'll be an indemnity plan. I'd suggest you take a look at what's actually in the federal code, because the federal code says it's 100% for birds, and they'll pay up to 50% on other species. So I've encouraged MPPC to take a look at that, because I don't want to have to convince anybody that we need the other half when you're actually in the event. But you'll get indemnification. But one of the things that we run into with indemnification is they'll pay you for your birds, or in this case, they'll pay you for your hogs. But the reality is you have no product to sell for months. The buildings are empty. So you go through a whole period of time to depopulate, clean up the buildings, try and get them back in production, and go through that whole process. And if you visited with your colleagues in the poultry industry, that's a long time. You can be down a long while with nothing to sell. And that's really where the challenge was. So when I was working in Washington, for example, I was trying to determine whether we could pay for lost production through USDA. The only incidents that I found was that it would actually pay for lost production to the orange grove operators. So if they ended up with citrus canker in an orange grove, they would pay them for lost production, because it took 25 years to get a productive grove, and try and get that back. And it was the only time I saw where they actually paid for lost production. So that's a big part of the equation as well. And we establish areas. If you get an infected site, we're going to establish a smaller zone than we do in birds, but it could be 5 kilometers. So movements in and out of that site need permits. There'll be test requirements in order to move them, to make sure we're not moving infected animals. All those sorts of pieces as we've done with the other commodities. But I think the 72-hour one is one I'd encourage everyone to take a close look at, because there's really critical pieces that go with each of that. So whether it's preparedness at the farm level, it's preparedness at the packing plant, preparedness in the laboratories with the veterinarians. Now I'm in the veterinary college. And one of the things I'm encouraging our students to do is take a look at animal agriculture. Because the reality is you can talk to them about a poultry operation or swine operation, et cetera, but as also was mentioned this morning, they really have no idea what you're talking about. Now, once exposed to it, they may become interested in it. I've had some that have come from the city, and they've looked at poultry operations, swine, and said, yeah, that's pretty cool, I think I'll do that. But just to talk about animal agriculture, they really don't know what you're talking about. But it seems to me all of this comes together in one piece. And regardless of whether you're in production agriculture, a veterinarian, a diagnostician, and a laboratory, you're one of the many allied industries that support the sector, whether it's trucking, feed, equipment, whatever all these various components are. It seems to me that we do all of this for one purpose and one purpose only, and that's to protect the agricultural assets of the nation. I mean, we can get down to talking about genetics, as was done this morning, or marketing, as was done this morning, or diagnostics, et cetera, but really what you're doing is trying to protect the agricultural assets of the nation. Because as one of the things that has always worried me, I never want to get in a situation where I'm relying on another country to provide my food. I think that's really, really critical. And fundamentally for me, that's what drove me. I mean, we can talk about all the finer details of raising hogs. Now, there'll be talks on composting, there'll be talks on biosecurity, and they're all critically important. But when you peel all that away, what are we really trying to accomplish? You're trying to protect the agricultural assets of the nation. And that's why I was in Washington after 9/11. They invited me to come out and say, so what do we really do to protect this asset? I can remember walking into a briefing out there one time, and I'd just taken a trip to Kansas. And there was we took a trip to Holcomb, Kansas, and at the time it was the largest beef processing plant in the world, maybe 9,000 head a day. So I walked into that briefing with an aerial picture of that packing plant. And they're like, where in the world did you get that? I said, it only took 3 seconds, it's online. Anybody has it. So if the opposition wants it, they can get it. And I drove out here 7 hours yesterday and came across Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa, and if somebody wants to destroy agriculture, it's pretty easy to get to. It's in every field out across all that country, isn't it? Now, it may be a little harder to get in the buildings, but there are those who would choose to tear down what we have. So what you're really about, day in and day out, is protecting that economy and the infrastructure of the United States. Because that's really what, again, drives me, because I don't want to ever rely on somebody else for food. And that's really critical for all of us. I appreciate your time here today. Time for questions? Questions of me? Yes. She's got a mic. I've got great help here today.
In the event of an FAD, like African swine fever, FMD, are there measures in place to keep from flooding our non-labs with the testing that's going to be needed to detect in the 72-hour plus shutdown?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what's basically the capability of the non system? One of the nice things about that, since it is part of that network, that can be reallocated to another laboratory if need be. I think one of the things that's really been helpful is with the automation and the testing systems that we have now, we can run a lot of samples. And many of the laboratories actually were very successful in getting additional certification to run COVID samples for universities. Purdue was, I suspect Iowa State was here as well. And it was a way to basically prove that we can do throughput in an event. And similarly, this could be done. So I think the capacity is there. It may be necessary, depending on how broad that event might be, that we'll have to shift samples to other parts of that null network, but it exists. I'm confident we can get that done. Yeah.
Dr. Marsh, always appreciate your insight. You broached the topic of the New World screwworm, so I'm going to ask 2 questions if I could. First being, in a response, I understand the radiated fly is kind of that treatment or prevention, whatever. In the event of an introduction in the circle that you, with your tuna can, drove around in the plat book, will that be a stop movement act in this event? And I just have to imagine it'd be everything, horses, pigs, cattle. I mean, I'm just curious what your response would be to it.
Yeah, the case of the New World screwworm, I gotta slow down when I say that, it likely will not be the circles and zones because of the way it's introduced. We have actually had it from time to time into the country. For example, I remember a small animal practitioner, I think it was in Georgia, diagnosed a dog that was limping and actually had it in the foot pad. So we get it on occasion. It came back from a military base in Central or South America. So indeed, they irradiate flies. There's a facility in Panama where they irradiate flies. And thanks to our entomologists, they learned that those flies only mate once. So if they sterilize those flies and they mate just once, they don't reproduce. And so that's the end of the cycle. And that's what's been successful over the years. I see the Secretary of Agriculture has proposed to place a new facility. So several $1 million to build another one to get it up and going so that we can produce more of those flies to keep it from coming into the United States. I can remember some of the old timers when I first got started. They're even older than Howard and I, but they would talk about being in southern United States and they dealt with the screwworm. And they said if you had calves, for example, that umbilicus, they'd be on them immediately. And so you'd lose calves, and particularly also white-tailed deer in southern part of the United States, said you never saw a fawn because a screwworm would get them. So I don't think we'd have zones in the same kind of way, but the consequences could be large for us as well. Howard?
Yeah, I don't know whether to call you Bret or
Bret.
Doctor or Dean. Which do
I was Bret long before I was any of the rest of them. So
this doesn't have anything to do with your talk. I'm just curious. I was reading your little resume here, and it says you're also the CEO of the clinical facility at Purdue. Is that typical? I mean, to do at Purdue, is that traditionally you're the CEO if you're the dean or not?
No, that's a new title. That's a new title, and so yes, I'm CEO of the hospitals as well. We have new hospitals, about 110,000 square feet, were added 3 years ago, and so we have that. We also have a satellite equine surgery center in southeast Indiana, so I'm responsible for running the hospitals as well.
So you're the CEO. That's a permanent. You're not just interim.
No, that's permanent,
okay.
permanent task, and it was delivered on the part of the search committee.
They figured you didn't have enough to do as dean, huh?
That's right. Another role there. No, that's a great question, but it's not common.
You didn't tell the story about your parking ticket.
Oh, well, I have to, okay. I'm not from academia, as you know. I worked in public service for many, many years, and so I was telling Howard that I came back to the campus. I'm an alum of Purdue, and I came back, and so they said the first day, they said, you need to go across campus and get a picture ID. And I said, okay. So I walked across campus, and she said, have a seat right there. We'll take your picture, and in just 2 or 3 minutes, we'll have an ID for you. And sure enough, I had a new picture ID. I'm a Purdue employee, et cetera. So I said, well, I understand I can get a parking permit here in this same building. She said, yeah, that's true. She said, drop to the lower level and go to the west end. And she said, go down to G54 and they'll get you a parking permit. And I said, okay. So I went down there and walked in the door. And she was sitting there and said, I told her I'm a new Purdue employee. I need a parking permit. And she said, but do you have a picture ID? I said, yes, I have a picture ID. It's newly minted. I was just given it. So she worked at her computer a little bit, and she said, yes, but you're not in our system. I can't issue you a parking permit. And I said, well, okay. Well, actually, she said, I could issue a parking permit, a guest permit, but I'll need a letter from your dean. So getting used to the new system has been fascinating as well. I asked her if she had a napkin. I'd be happy to scroll something out for her. So yeah, I'm learning the new system there at the university. It's been a lot of fun. Well, thanks for your attention here today. I appreciate it. Thank you.